My name is Elliot Williams, and I'm the training manager at the National Press Club Journalism Institute. Thank you for spending your time with us this Friday. A few things to note before we begin. We are recording this program, and highlights from the recording will appear on our website and in our daily newsletter for journalists, which you can subscribe to using the link in our chat. Please feel free to submit questions using the chat or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Your questions will be addressed throughout the program, and I'll make sure that we try to get to as many as possible in this hour. Today, we're joined by two representatives of the DC Open Government Coalition, an organization that educates and advocates for DC government transparency and empowers the public to gain access to information. On August 22nd, they published a memo urging journalists to familiarize themselves with the DC Code, to buff up on their First, Fourth, and Amendment rights knowledge, and to start requesting arrest records to contextualize the federal takeover of DC law enforcement. But before we get into that, let me introduce our guest speakers. We have Robert Becker, a longtime media lawyer and board member for the coalition. Robert is a former reporter and has over 25 years of experience in civil and criminal appellate litigation. He represents publishers, editors, writers, journalists like yourselves, and other creative individuals and businesses. And he was previously a staff attorney for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. Welcome, Robert.
Hi, good morning.
And then we have Fritz Mulhauser, who's an attorney and co-chair of the coalition's legal committee. Fritz was a staff attorney for 22 years with the American Civil Liberties Union here in DC, where he specialized in police accountability. He has decades of experience using public records, access tools, and regularly writes about FOIA, open meetings, and open data issues for the coalition's blog. Welcome, Fritz.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Today, our goal is not to debate the political merit of the Trump administration's actions or the DC government's response. Rather, we'll be discussing what Fritz and Robert described in their memo, which is the public's right to access certain records under DC law and the First Amendment, and journalists' responsibility to collect and share that info with citizens of the district and beyond who deserve to know the full facts behind the many narratives out there so they can evaluate the claims for themselves. We ask that you remain respectful of others in this group and the time we're sharing this afternoon. So Robert and Fritz, why don't we start? And I'll ask that you share a bit about the DC Open Government Coalition and how it can be of use to journalists on this call.
Fritz?
Thanks for asking about the coalition. It's been active in DC for 15 years or so, founded by Tom Sussman, a longtime Freedom of Information Act expert on the federal side. And he and others realized there was no advocacy in the district for the proper functioning of the access laws, which protect everyone's access to records, to meetings, and data. And so the coalition is a volunteer group, a board of about 15 people, lawyers and others, community activists who use these tools and others who defend the tools themselves. And we've been busy for all those years helping people who need access to records and going to bat for them in the executive and in the DC Council to make sure that there's funding and statutory improvements and regulatory improvements where needed. And we've had a number of good successes. For example, the DC Council stopped asserting a privilege to not reveal its emails to FOIA requesters. And another work in progress is attempting to clarify access to databases that the government has, which surprisingly they've asserted a right to keep secret. So the work is never ending, and we've been pleased to help a lot of people in these years and glad to be here today.
Well, it's great work you do. Bob, do you want to add anything to that?
The thing that I would add is one of the things we have known for a long time is that Metropolitan Police are essentially a black hole when it comes to information. They wish they were not under the FOI Act. They apply a very expansive definition of personal privacy to withhold information as far as they're concerned, any personal identifier is would revealing that would be a clearly unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. So they don't. And so what we started out, particularly with this project, was set to ensure that people understood that some of that information is available by statute, separate from the FOI Act. But the statute specifically mandates public access to that personal information.
Right. And you mentioned to my colleague in a Q&A that, you wouldn't necessarily think of this as a FOIA issue, as a FOI issue. Can you explain that a bit more? And by this, I mean the arrests and the influx of federal officers.
Yeah, one of the problems you always have with FOIA is you have to make a request, and the government has a certain number of days, 10 or 15 days, to respond, which turns in, because they're business days, turns into 2 to 3 weeks. That's, you can't cover breaking news within that circumstance. So what we are focusing on is there are statutes other than FOIA that specifically give the public access to arrest logs in the district's 7 police districts. So that you can get this information the day after the arrest, because it's supposed to be an arrest book at the precinct. Now, we have learned recently that each district has a list, a mailing list people can sign up for to receive emails from MPD, and they send out an email version of the arrests. But that version, consistent with their expansive version of privacy, does not include significant amount of personal identifiers. It includes names, I believe race, it may include age, where the arrest happened, but it doesn't include any other personal information about either the person arrested or the complainant.
So if a journalist or a member of the public were to, seek out additional information beyond that, where would they start? And, especially given the timeliness, as you said.
Yeah, you could certainly sign up to get these emails every day from each district. But in order to get all of the information, you would have to go down to the district and ask to see the arrest book, which includes all of the arrests for the past 30 days. So soon we will get to the point, because I guess it was started on the 11th is when this takeover started. You're going to get past the 30 days and you're not going to be able to see anything there before the takeover.
So it's sort of imperative to, if you're trying to get anything from the previous 30 days, to do that soon.
Yeah, if you want to compare what was going on the week before to what's going on now, then you got to do it fairly quickly.
It makes me think, have you seen any recent examples of stories, journalists, newsrooms that are doing this actively, doing it well, and particularly contextualizing the arrest data, this takeover in a timely way, and that we can sort of learn from?
Let me try to address that one. I had opportunity to chat with a member of the Times, New York Times staff. They recently assigned 12 people, and the results of their work are very revealing, both of how much work it takes and of the limited results still you can find. They tried to track the results of the new police regime, which includes, of course, in the district now, National Guard people from several states, DC National Guard people, over 2,200 all told, plus a wide range of federal employees, both sworn and not sworn. And the rules of what they're to do and their assignments are completely opaque. But they tried to follow the arrests to see the results of the work. And they had to start with a list of arrests that they got from the court, which is not subject to any information access laws, then trace the cases to the court's online database. so that in the database they could read, if there were any, police sworn statements of why they'd arrested people. So they started with 1,000 cases, and they could find sworn statements for only part of those. So even though you would think these are people who've been brought to court, that first arrested in the street, locked up, brought to court, arraigned, and a case number assigned, you still couldn't find the sworn police statements for all those arrests. When they did find them, they then tried to figure out what had happened. First, what did the person do, according to the police? And second, what were the different police actions? Because the Constitution protects all of us against unreasonable stops or seizures, arrests, and it's crucial that the police have good reason when they take these actions. So the point of the Times piece was to try and find out who is doing what in the street and with what rationale. And their story is remarkable because they couldn't find it for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases. And that's, one of the most powerful journalism engines in the country, with over a dozen people assigned for all this schlepping around with sources of data and merging of files, and a devoted data reporter to pull it together quantitatively. It was astonishing for us to see how hard they worked, and still how you couldn't really tell all that's going on out there.
And you have to keep in mind that the public has a First Amendment right of access to criminal proceedings in DC courts and in federal courts. The US Supreme Court has issued, 4 or 5 opinions on this, saying very clearly that because of the immense power of prosecutors and cops, the public has the right to oversee what they're doing. And so the records related to criminal cases and the proceedings themselves are open to the public under the First Amendment.
Right. And we have a question here in the chat. It's a great question to sort of back up a bit. Some of these arrests, and I'd say many of these arrests, are being made not by MPD officers, but by federal officers. Is there a way to get those arrest records?
The statute specifically says that arrests may, in the district, as some of you may know, there are many police departments. There's the Park Service, Park Police, there are the Federal Protective Service. There are a whole bunch of police organizations that can make arrests in the district and charge people under the DC code. And if the crimes are federal or happen on federal property, they can charge federal crimes. When the statute says that when a person is arrested by a law enforcement agency other than the MPD, that agency has a duty to report to MPD the fact of the arrest and the information that would go in the arrest book. And it also directs the US Attorney General and the courts, both federal and DC, to notify MPD when charges are filed in those places. It doesn't distinguish federal crimes from DC crimes. All arrests in the district are supposed to be copied to MPD. So they should be. Whether that's actually happening, we have no way of knowing.
Right, right.
And certainly with ICE arrests, they're not.
The question that you asked reveals one of the big unknowns, which is, to what extent is ordinary police work, finding crime, arresting people who did it, and so on, being done by our police or by federal officials? And what rules, therefore, apply to those different actors? DC police are under strict orders about how they behave. They can't conceal their identity in public. They can't shoot people for no reason. They can't seize you without probable cause, and so on. There is no available information yet on the rules governing the thousands of people now policing in the street. And the Inquirer's question about how do we know about arrests goes back, I take it back to the New York Times effort. They could find in the sworn police statements only a few times to be clear about what the federal role was. They had a category of information they looked for in the sworn police statements called federal involvement. Did the federal agents first catch the person and then call up the police and say, come get them, like a Walgreens store guard would do? Or are they making arrests? I just read in the Attorney General's lawsuit filed yesterday to stop the deployment of National Guard that they have been deputized. That's an important legal step which would give them arrest powers. And I've never seen further information about that. But the question about tracking arrests goes back to who's making them and under what authority. And that's absolutely not transparent yet.
Right.
Now, add to that one thing. If the arrest is in fact reported to MPD, if it's made by a federal officer, the arrest book should show who the officer who made the arrest was, who would either be the arresting officer or in some cases the complainant, because the officer may claim that he or she saw a criminal act happen and therefore they become the complaining witness. So identifying which agency arrested may be there in the arrest book. We can't be sure of that, but that should, if the procedure is working, that should be there.
Right.
It will be really interesting if members of the press pursue this arrest book access. We've been touting it to anyone who asks us, how do we find out about arrests, to know who's doing what in the street. And we have not yet found anybody who has tried to demand the statutory access Bob's been describing, been denied, and then tried to pursue that to get it enforced. So it's
Or publicize the fact that they were denied.
exactly. So it's a very important access right, quite apart from the Freedom of Information laws, and it's simply not been tested at a time when we need it.
We have a follow-up question actually from the original inquirer, James, asking about, they're a newer reporter and want to know what rights they have when going up to, say, an ICE officer. They've seen ICE downtown, the Chinatown Metro, and on their own street. They want to go up and talk. What rights do the public and what rights do, a member of the press have when, like, what are the best practices in that situation?
The MPD general orders very clearly say that MPD officers are not to interfere with citizens with recording what's going on in front of them in the street. Now, whether federal officers will follow the general order, we don't know. But certainly MPD officers are quite clearly directed that unless a journalist or even an ordinary person on the street gets in the middle of an arrest or somehow hinders police, that they should not be prevented from recording what they see. That said, what is hindering the police at any given situation is in the eyes of the officer on the scene. So you can ask questions. Certainly, you may not get answers. Don't get in too close, and don't try to avoid being viewed as being in the middle of it.
It's important to draw the distinction, which I know gets terribly confusing, between the different kinds of folks in the street who are swarming our city. ICE is the federal Department of Homeland Security enforcing federal immigration law. And those officers have an entirely different chain of command and legal authority and task and mission, which is being debated nationwide because of the pressure to cope with folks in this country that our administration thinks are here incorrectly. Uh, but ICE is going to be performing its duties in the streets of DC in a way that's entirely outside the discourse we've been having about police and crime, uh, because they simply are a different animal working under a different set of rules. And the Times reporting, for instance, has nothing to do with the immigration related activities of ICE.
Mm.
And those cases don't go to either the district court, federal district court, or the superior court. They go through a whole different system. They are probably taken elsewhere, not booked through the central cell block in downtown DC.
If you're
And
looking,
the case of Mr. Abrigo Garcia shows the lengths that this administration is taking to find and deport people that they think are here incorrectly. Uh, and it was heroic legal work to find out where he had been taken, and to assert his rights entirely apart from the criminal justice system. The immigration legal system is just a whole separate operation, uh, that's and which has made it difficult to cover from the press or to influence by activists.
so if you're looking for those records, you are not going then to the DC Superior Court. You're not going to room
Yeah.
C10. You're in the rest books.
Yeah.
I mean, to this point, many of the arrests are happening with officers without insignias identifying their agency. Are there other ways to determine who's conducting, say, a raid or an arrest? Is there any sort of database or place where people are making these identifying, just sharing which officers are doing what?
I have not seen anything. If the arrest book shows that a federal officer was the complaining witness or the arresting officer, that's the way I know of. But I haven't seen anything about how you identify these people who are walking around with masks and no badges.
Hmm. I'm curious too, in which situations it's useful or necessary to identify yourself as a reporter when either interviewing or asking questions, recording.
I think a lot of reporters who do street reporting or have done police reporting understand these rules. Um, it's, in crowd control always becomes an issue. Somebody's making law enforcement is making an arrest. And if a crowd's gathering, crowd control becomes an issue and they may push everybody back. If you are clearly identified as a reporter, they may not push you back as far as they push other people. So I think you got to use your judgment about that. You got no special rights. Okay. You can't say because I'm a reporter, you have to talk to me. You can't say because I'm a reporter, you have to let me stand right close to you. But certainly being clearly identified would be helpful to you. Right.
That makes sense. Robert, you told us recently in an interview that if journalists are stonewalled in their reporting process, they should speak up and say, look, we tried to access this information and we've been refused that information. So who should journalists tell? What resources do they have?
One of the things that reporters don't like to do is become part of the story. So they don't tell the public what obstacles they run into. If a reporter goes to a precinct and asks to see the arrest book, and either they're refused or they are given a copy of this email that's been sanitized so it only includes some of the information, and MPD is refusing to disclose the full arrest book, then publish that. Tell the public that they are hiding stuff that you have a right to know. And it's important, as I tried to do in that memo, to make people understand that the right to know who's being arrested protects all of us from overreach and abusive policing and abusive prosecution. It protects our rights under the First Amendment. It protects our rights under the Fourth and Fifth Amendment. So the public has a right to know that, not because we're nosy or because we want to sell newspapers, but because that protects everyone from an abusive government process. And so letting the public know when you are being stonewalled is a really important thing to do.
One thing that we've tried over the years is to encourage reporters to ask their editors to include that they got records by using the Freedom of Information Act or other statutes so that people could see that those laws are at work to help with transparency. And we've had some success. The Post even published a lovely cartoon, took a whole page chronicling the work of their FOIA editor to get records. And they have started including obtained by the Post under the Freedom of Information Act in their write-ups of sources, whereas before they would just say obtained by the Post. But from our point of view, helping the public and the government be aware that these access rights are in statute and are useful is important.
We have a few questions actually about recording officers. Amanda in the chat says that as far as being on the ground during this, they often just leave when you show up, especially if there's a photo or a video being taken. Someone in the Q&A also, mentioned do some agencies like the FBI are they more adverse than other agencies to being recorded or photographed?
I can't answer that question. I think the use of masks and no badges, no identifying insignia says a lot. It should not be happening because police, in the course of doing their jobs, have no privacy right. They have the ability, if there are threats, to deal with those threats, but that's not by hiding their identities. They are public officials exercising a very significant power that results in individuals losing their liberty. And even for whether it's overnight or for a long time. And those people should be identifiable and should be identified.
It was interesting that the mayor of DC, in announcing a few days ago that she wouldn't mind, or actually may even look forward to having continued help from the feds in crime and community efforts of other kinds. She put at the very last sentence of her discussion of this that she would hope to do so with respecting, with those additional federal resources, respecting DC law and policy that officers identify themselves by wearing badges and never wear masks. Those are in law in DC. They've long governed police here. And it was notable, I thought, that she mentioned these dimensions of openness that Bob describes as something that she was going to be looking for as cooperation goes forward.
And you have a right, if police are abusive to you or somebody you know or somebody else, you have a right to file a complaint. In DC, there's a civilian complaint review board. In the federal system, you may have to file it with the internal affairs division of the agency involved. But the point is, if you can't identify the person who did it, how can you file a complaint about abuse? So that should never be the situation, that you can't identify the person who's arresting you.
We have a question around plainclothes officers. Are there any rules around plainclothes officers open carrying guns, and specifically if you can answer around MPD?
Well, I mean, plainclothes officers are authorized to carry guns. There are no specific rules. There are undercover officers at times, okay? And I can understand when a law enforcement agency has an officer who is operating undercover who's involved in an arrest. That becomes a sensitive issue, but they should raise that issue specifically about that person in that situation, not on the street. I think reporters should assume that any officer who is involved in an action that occurs in a public place, on the street, in a public building, anywhere like that, in a park, those officers have a duty to be identifiable. and they should be, you should be able to tell who they are. If they're undercover, they're supposed to, or if they're not undercover, they're supposed to identify themselves when they approach somebody as an officer. Otherwise, why should I talk to them? And you have a right to walk away. An individual who is approached by an officer has a right to walk away. They don't have to talk. So if it's a person in plain clothes, that's their problem, but they have a duty to identify themselves before as a cop.
An interesting sidebar on the question of transparency of police work in the street is the now familiar, but actually originally revolutionary notion of body-worn cameras. And DC police, starting in 2015, adopted body-worn cameras, and our coalition fought fiercely because the mayor's position was no one should ever see the video that resulted. And the council, the DC legislature, DC council said, no, it will be the policy of the district that those videos are as accessible as any other records, subject to protection of privacy where needed, or of police secrets if needed even. So a decade of body-worn camera access has ensued, and we have fought many battles about that. Officers wrongly believe that they should not be identifiable on body-worn camera video footage if released to the public, and the council has said no to that. But my point about today's conversation is that it will be interesting if some reporters or the public tries to understand some, let's say there's a confusing arrest with multiple federal officials and MPD on the scene, or fire department, or how many other people, but an officer from MPD had a body-worn camera and there's video. So let's go to the videotape and see what really happened. I haven't heard yet of anyone trying to get body cam footage of some of the last 3 weeks street policing to see just exactly who did what. Defense attorneys representing people arrested in confusing situations may well want to see those videos. And that'll set up a new discussion about how fast did the videos come out? Much are they redacted? Are those redactions according to law? And that could give us new evidence of what's been going on in the street.
That's a great point. We have a question in the Q&A about what you all were talking about with arrest records. If you could just, this may be someone who missed the first part of that. If you could just kind of briefly overview again, access to arrest records and kind of where you would start specifically as it relates to, the email list you mentioned and going in person to collect that data.
Yeah, and let me just say, I understand that there are 7 districts, and it takes a lot of resources to go to all 7 of them any day and collect them. One of the things that would be really nice is to have some group of news outlets or reporters agree, I'll go to station, the 1st district, you go to the 4th district, and then put them online so that everybody can get them. You're not interfering with each other doing stories, you're just providing information, and it would certainly cut down the labor for each individual organization. But there is a statute that requires every day for each district to put in its arrest book all of the arrests that happened in the previous 24 hours. And that information includes the name of the arrestee, address, gender, age, race, the charges filed against them, and other similar information about the complainant, who may or may not be a police officer, and the name of the arresting officer and the charges that have been lodged, at least initially, against the person that caused the arrest. And so you should be able to get that information by going to the district and asking to see the arrest book, because the statute requires that. Each individual district apparently has an email list of people who want to receive information about what's happening in that district, and they send out each day a redacted version of that list, which includes names, and some other information about the arrested people, but is redacted to exclude a lot of the information that you would find useful. So you can sign up to receive those emails every day, but they are not going to give you everything you need. The other resource is every day in courtroom C10 on the C level of the DC Superior Court building, there is a lockup list for everybody who will appear, who is detained and will appear in court that day for arraignment. And you can see that lockup list down either right outside the courtroom or possibly in the CJA office, which is down the hall. So that list will provide information which you can correlate with the arrest lists if you have them, to find out about the cases themselves.
Well, let's just recapitulate again from the beginning of our discussion that the exemplary Times reporting on 1,000 arrests uh, required merging information from the arrest details Bob was discussing with the text of an affidavit from the arresting officer, uh, and that text is entered into the court record of every individual criminal case, and it takes a separate mining effort to go online to the court system called CourtView, look up a case number, look for the police affidavit that should be filed, and of the 1,000 arrests which had been processed and were going to go forward to trial that the Times studied over the last 2.5 weeks, 500 didn't have those sworn affidavits in the court file. So not only do you have to merge multiple sources to really understand arrests, but the sources aren't as helpful as they should be because they're just not brought up to date in nearly as real time quickly as you would like.
Now
500 of
you can
1,000 couldn't be tracked.
yeah, you can search CourtView. You don't need the case number. You can search CourtView by names. You can do that by going to dccourts.gov and look for online services, and that will give you a link to search cases.
And we're sharing some of those resources in the chat now. It sounds like a lot of work, but it sounds like it's important work. We have two questions actually related to street camera access. Do DC police make that footage available? Would you need to FOIA to gain access to footage from street cameras? And how long do they retain that video?
As far as I know, there is no regular way of getting it. You could ask for street cams where they are, and but through FOIA. I'm fairly certain that MPD would resist the same way it resists releasing body cam video, but I don't know that for sure. But it is certainly worth a try. But again, DC is not, in some places there may be a lot of street cams, but in other places there are none. This is not like London. where the police can see just about everywhere on this in public.
So it sort of depends, and especially if you're trying to use that footage to get records on arrests, that you may face issues there.
Yeah, and the other thing is, there is a program where individuals with Ring cameras and other Bell cameras can allow MPD to look at their footage in a specific kinds of events. Whether they're keeping any of that or not, I don't know. And I doubt that they're going to be very willing to make that public unless forced to.
Now, this is another question from our Q&A, is there a major difference between the arrest records you'd see in person at the district in that book versus the emailed list?
Yes, most of the personal identifying information is not in the emails. They are heavily sanitized because of MPD's very broad view of personal privacy. but the statute requires them to put a lot of identifying information into the arrest book.
What other types of crime information or data is worth FOIAing? I know you mentioned this isn't necessarily a FOIA issue, but you did just mention with the street camera that might be, it might lead you somewhere. Are there other pieces of information you recommend looking into?
Well, one of the things that came up that we've talked about recently is, and if you look at, I think we gave you a link on opendata.dc.gov to some MPD data sets. There is one on stops. Every time an officer stops somebody on the street, for example, to ask them where they live, why they're there, all kinds of things that they don't have a right to ask, but they do. Um, they are supposed to enter into their database the name of the person and other information about them, the reason for the stop. There is a data set that's been heavily sanitized that doesn't include names of those stops. Whether you could get more information by filing a FOIA request for more detailed stuff about those stops is another area that might be helpful.
Fritz, anything to add?
No. Yeah. Let me add one thing about an earlier question. Uh, the scale of police activity in the district needs to be broken down into a question. What is happening about normal kinds of police work against crime versus what is happening in the street and visible regarding immigration? And we have the Times and others reporting on around 1,000, probably 1,000 to 2,000 by now, arrests for the enforcement of criminal laws, normal police work. As to immigration, because there are so many people in the street and they're so visible around workplaces and schools and others that concern the community, there's a concern for what's going on there. The only quantitative estimate I've seen of how many arrests, or not arrests, but pickups of people for alleged immigration violations is again, in the Times report. And when I asked the data reporter eagerly to learn what his source had been, I learned that they had asked the administration, and somewhere in Homeland or the White House the number had been coughed up around 400. So that gives you a sense that there's a lot of people in the street, but the actual number so far is in the low hundreds.
Well, except that there was one other number I think the Post had, which was about 40, and that may have come from the White House, about 40% of the arrests that were made were ICE arrests at one point. I don't know whether that
Okay.
holds true
Yeah,
now.
that could be 40% of 1,000 is 400. The really interesting question that reporting could shed light on is whether there's more inefficient efforts going on that don't really address significant crime or that aren't even lawful efforts of crime fighting. And that requires looking at, in the long term, how many arrests result in prosecutions that are successful. But there's an interesting step along the way we haven't mentioned, which is called papering. And that's where the prosecutors review police officers' accounts of what happened. What witness said what about a crime, or what did the officer see that was a crime? And then the prosecutor makes a judgment call whether to proceed with prosecution. Uh, it's reported in past years that a quarter or more of arrests were no papered, which means the prosecutors didn't find them to have merit. They weren't there hadn't been a good fighting of crime in those arrests. We're also hearing from reporting that the present rate of no papering is much, much lower. That is to say, also it's been reported, but without any records confirming it, that the U.S. Attorney, the chief prosecutor in D.C., is urging the papering of as many cases as possible. So the effort to describe if this new crime fighting is really working it needs some further analysis of what's going on with the numbers of arrests that are going to magistrates for arraignment and how are they faring. There have been some dramatic reports on the federal side that judges there have told the prosecutors that their arrests that they were presenting were shaky and they would not proceed with prosecution. And that's an interesting question, which we just don't have enough data and sources yet talking to explain.
And one other thing I would really like to see is somebody go back and look at what happened at the same time last year and see whether the number of arrests, the number of guns taken off the street are any different, any more or less than MPD took off the, did a year ago, for example, at the same time. So, comparison, is this actually doing anything, or is it just a lot of people running around in various areas accomplishing nothing more than was accomplished by MPD?
We have a question from a journalist who covers homelessness, and they know that there are several arrests that may be related to homelessness, for example, open container arrests, but it's hard to tell from initial or even arrest reports. Are there any tips or tricks for how to figure out which arrests they should look into? How many arrests are related to homelessness in some way? Is there any indicator of that?
It's they're probably going to be charged as fairly low-level offenses, maybe vagrancy. There is a class of offenses called petty offenses. They are things for which the person is given a citation and told to appear on a future date, or they can post the bond, which is equivalent to the fine, and be released. Um, those are things that don't show up in C10 because they are such minor crimes that that they don't uh, they don't require real um, uh, involvement of the judicial system. They're in a way like traffic offenses. But homelessness isn't a crime, but it appears based on what the federal officers have been doing, and some of the bills that were put in by Republicans in the House, that they are trying to make it a crime. In other words, if you get it's now the bill that's in there, it talks about it's illegal to camp on public property. Okay, well, okay, homeless people live on how do you define camp? You have to have a tent. um, but basically what they're trying to do is criminalize homelessness, and homelessness is not a crime, and covering that is difficult. The best thing I can tell you is talk to the people who interact with homeless people, the NGOs that provide them services that get them into shelter when it gets very cold. Those are the people who can tell you what's going on with homelessness.
The prime advocacy organization in the district is the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless. And clearing of encampments, as we know from reporting nationwide, is a problem in lots of places because there's simply no place for folks to go. And the Supreme Court allowed the arrest of people and the clearing of encampments, even though there was no place for them to go. But in the district, clearing of encampments is simply not typically a police activity. It's done by public works who are sent to collect messy trash piles. And so there are rules governing that process. There has to be posting of a clearing that's coming so folks can safeguard their possessions and so on. But it's another piece of what's going on now. But again, outside of the police enforcing the DC code, because there simply is no law that forces people to not sleep in encampments. The federal people may claim that the small parks that they're clearing, which I believe have been the major locations of a current round of clearing, that those are being cleared under federal law. But then we're back to the question, who's doing it? Can you identify them? Are they obeying those federal laws? And I haven't seen reporting yet about that, but the legal clinic for the homeless would be on top of it.
We have time for two more questions, and we have two questions actually in our Q&A. Fritz, for you, I know you've mentioned the Times report. Did it show any data or reporting around the suburbs and the impact of, these actions on, yes, this is happening in DC. How does it impact suburban Maryland, Virginia, anything about that?
No.
And I would add to that, obviously that's a bigger topic, beyond the district, but this is obviously something that has been threatened in other cities in terms of the federal takeover. So what warning signs should journalists in other cities watch for regarding potential changes in information access? And if you're a reporter, I know we have some folks tuning in from other cities. If you're a journalist elsewhere, how can they prepare? What can they learn from DC open data and open government in their own cities?
I think the thing to do is in each city or each state, you have to go and look at the laws, particularly about what has to be published, what has to be made public, like in the arrest logs here, so that you're prepared to get the same kind of information in other places. One place that you might get help for that is the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, which has over the years done reports on access to police records, for example, access to court records in state by state. So you might get some help from them if suddenly they turn the National Guard loose in Baltimore or Chicago or whatever. Then you're going to have to look at the statutes specific to those jurisdictions to figure out where the best information sources are and what you're entitled to.
The significant difference will be everywhere else that's being talked about, whether Chicago, New Orleans, Baltimore, or whatever, there will be the question of the power of the state to rule over what's going on. Our mayor in the District of Columbia is not equivalent to a governor in that regard. The National Guard of DC that's been deployed here answers only to the president, not to the mayor, who is not a governor. In all the other states, and most notably in Chicago, the governor has said they're not looking forward to any troops coming, and they're going to have a lot to say about what they do if they do show up. As in California, a federal judge said much of what the National Guard did there was just plain wrong. So that's because California, et cetera, is not like DC. And so the reporters in those other places will have a great deal of things to cover as the governors and state laws kick in. And you have all the tools of access to records up and down the levels of state government to find out what's going on in Chicago or New Orleans or wherever it happens next.
The other thing to keep in mind is the district is peculiar in another way. DC crimes under the DC code can be prosecuted here in federal court or in DC Superior Court. So you have seen cases, for example, where Sandwich Man was taken to federal court for an assault on a federal officer, such as it was. That will not happen in another place because the federal authorities don't have authority, unless the governor allows it, to enforce local law. They can only enforce federal law, and they can only enforce federal law like that on federal property. So if it happens in the lobby of the federal building, you certainly could be arrested for it there by a federal agent. But if it happens on the streets of Chicago in Jackson Square Park, then you can't do that. They don't have the authority to arrest you for a criminal offense under the Illinois Code. So it's a very different environment there than it is here.
Elliot, let me add that we're very open to being asked questions later. If folks have specific things they're working on and want to ask us about it, we're happy to chat with people. And there are organizations like us in other states, Freedom of Information coalitions, or similarly named groups elsewhere, and we can lead people to find those very active organizations that do just what we do in their own state. And they're all happy to help at a time like this, especially.
I'm glad you said that, Fritz. That was going to be my next question here is how can people best reach you? I know we have a few questions left, so I think we're out of time. But what I would ask is anyone, especially I know Jane, you put in the comment a question about flowchart, sort of what steps to take. I would ask that you follow up either with Fritz, Bob, or the Institute, and we'll make sure that those questions are addressed offline. But for Fritz and Bob, what are the best ways to reach you, to reach the DC Open Government Coalition for specific questions around freedom of information?
Okay, my email address is medialawyerdc@gmail.com. I will be happy to answer your questions if I can. The coalition's website is dcogc.org, and you can find a lot of information there about DC, and there's a link to contact us.
Wonderful. And we'll make sure that this all goes out in a follow-up email. Thank you both, Robert and Fritz. This is great. You've really illuminated this subject, and thank you to our audience for great questions. Again, we'll share a link to the recording soon, along with resources shared during this briefing and more. The National Press Club Journalism Institute is proud to produce these programs at no cost to journalists across the U.S. with the mission of powering strong journalism in the public interest. If you'd like to support us in this work, we hope you'll consider a donation today. And please spare a few minutes to fill out the survey to tell us how we did and to help improve our programming. Fritz, Robert, anything to add before I let you go?
That's it. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
Thank you again so much. There is literally so little that's being known about this crucial change in how our community does policing. And we count on the press to dig into it. And thanks for helping.
Absolutely. We hope you'll join us for our next program this Tuesday at noon. Finding the Money, Tips for Strengthening Proposals for Journalism Grants and Fellowships. So many people are out there looking for ways to fund their great journalism projects. So we'll pull back the curtain on how to find and position yourself to win those grants and fellowships designed for journalists. It'll be a conversation with representatives from the Pulitzer Center, National Press Foundation, and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. We hope to see you there. Again, thank you for joining us. I hope you all have a great weekend, and thanks again to our panelists today.